All right, welcome back, everybody. The attitudes and partisan allegiances of the rural voters has shifted dramatically over the past 40 years. Our two guests today have compiled some of the most thorough research into historical trends and paired that with a survey work to chart the continual change in the attitudes to help explain this shift. Dan Shea and Nick Jacobs are professors at Colby College in Maine and the authors of a new book, The Rural Voter: The Politics of Place and the Disunity of America. Dan and Nick, welcome to the Rural Progress Summit. And just before we get into our first question, as a reminder to the audience, we will only be taking questions through the Q&A window, so please submit your questions there as I talk with Dan and Nick. So welcome, Dan and Nick. First question, can you start us off by talking a little bit about the massive data set that you assembled and the work that went to organizing all the research in your book?
Well, maybe I'll jump in with the first piece. There are two elements to the data sets. The first is an aggregate election data set. One of the questions that Nick and I had right from the start was this divide that we're seeing between suburban, urban, and rural voters. Is it unique? Have we ever seen it? Is it an unprecedented change? So I'd like to jump in and say it's unprecedented, but my co-author is very careful on data. He said, well, no, we have to check this. So what we did was we put Colby College students to work in the summers for 2 summers, and we collected election data at the county level all the way back to 1824. Every
Wow.
county, every election, 1824. And we're able to put that data together and look at this picture. And what we find, sure enough, is it is unprecedented. We've seen short periods of an urban-rural divide. We've seen regional differences, but the massive swing that we see, the dramatic change that we see, is unprecedented. So that's the first bit of data, and maybe my co-author can tell you about our big surveys.
Yeah.
Well, first, thank you for hosting us and giving us an opportunity to share what we think we know about rural voters. And great summit, and enjoying many of the panels. So yeah, as Dan said, we then turn to rural voters themselves, right? There's a limit to what you can learn from aggregate data sets, county level measures of voter turnout and vote choice. I mean, the frustrating thing about studying democracy in the United States is that at the end of a very long and complicated process, we basically have two choices in this country: voting for the Republican or voting for the Democrat. And we just know people are a lot more complex, and they bring with them to the ballot box different motivations, different worldviews, different experiences. And the frustrating thing about existing research in rural politics is that a lot of the motivations that are unique to rural Americans don't even get asked.
Mm.
And so Dan and I, through about 250 unique questions, drawing on our own experience as rural residents and rural politics scholars, put those questions to about 10,000 rural voters.
Mm.
And you need to ask that many rural voters. I mean, most polls, most surveys, even gold standard Gallup, right, will ask 1,000 Americans this, and they might only get a couple dozen rural folks in the sample. We not only ask thousands of rural residents their opinions in order to overcome the problems of statistical certitude, but we also know that there's a lot of variation in the rural experience. And we want to speak about young people in rural America. We want to speak about non-white people who make up about a quarter now of rural America. So it's moving beyond just this simple dichotomy and getting as many voices as we can to tell that more complicated story of the rural experience.
And how did you get those surveys out? Because that's one thing I always, because I tend to read a lot of surveys and a lot of polls and stuff, and I'm always curious, like how do you get that out?
Well, we are very fortunate to work at an institution that I think in rural Maine that I think understands its responsibility to rural communities. And that's my sort of long way of saying they gave us money. It's expensive. It's quite expensive, and to be frank, I think that's why many, again, well-meaning polling outlets and public policy firms don't do it,
Right.
because finding, the hundreds of young people in rural communities that are kind of checked out of politics to begin with, and locating them and convincing them and really sort of harping on them to fill out your work. At the end of the day, it takes money and a
Yeah.
couple of tricks that we've learned over years of doing this.
My good friend Matt Hildreth at ruralorganizing.org, he emphasizes how a lot of polling gets. He's frustrated with a lot of polling because, like in Iowa, Polk County has a lot of rural in it, but like that's Des Moines also, and so those folks get lumped into an urban setting. And so, did you have that problem too, or?
Yeah. Oh, well, you're going to get us into the weeds.
Yeah,
I know
yeah.
these are great questions, and I love about these questions. I mean, just an example, I think Matt's concern is perfect. I've talked to him a little bit about it in the last couple of months. Ipsos, which is, again, not knocking Ipsos and the great people at Ipsos who I've worked with and are top notch and smart and sophisticated, but Ipsos uses a measure of ruralness that actually excludes 54% of individuals that the census says lives in a rural community.
Yeah.
So it sounds so easy, right? I mean,
Right.
any, and some people are convinced that with no expertise in rural politics, they can come into an election cycle and write a book on rural politics. It sounds so simple, and yet it, not only because, again, I come back to this idea that ruralness in this country is so vast and varied. You run into all sorts of complications that, yeah, we tried our best to overcome. I think we did
You know,
the best.
I'm just going to add, I feel like, Nick, I think I know the book you were referencing, but I will say an interesting line. There's a researcher that's done some work on rural America, rural politics, rural communities, from a big Ivy League school. And he does tell us in the book that if you're going to study rural America, you actually should go out into rural America every once in a while.
I think that's true to campaigns too. So when I ran for Congress in 2018 and 2020, one of the things I was known for is I bought a used Winnebago RV because they're made in my district, threw my logo on the side and went nonstop. And pretty much for 4 years campaigned out of that RV. And I got some cred knowing every state park that I stayed in, and all the RV parks, and got to see all 39 counties in the district quite well. So, but you guys mentioned that rural voters, that in the book, it mentions how things changed in the 1980s. Can you explain what that shift was all about?
Well, there are a couple different pieces. Maybe I'll take the first half or so. I will say that it's a tad controversial that we're making the mark in the 1980s. Other scholars have pushed back a little bit on that. We feel pretty confident that our data tells us that's the start of a very powerful, almost linear change. There were a series of tectonic shifts, really what we call bottom-up forces to begin with. There's top-down and bottom-up. The bottom up in the early 1980s was the farm crisis. The farm crisis was a big deal. It was, and we talk at length in the book about the causes of the farm crisis. But in short, we had hundreds and hundreds of farm foreclosures in each county in every state year after year. And it devastated these communities. Now, we say over and over in the book that rural does not mean farming per se, but often, as you know, there's an identity to these towns. There are ancillary businesses, there are banks, there are diners, and so forth. The farm crisis in the early 1980s was a heavy, heavy hit. Some of you might remember, the Live Aid, Farm Aid concerts, and so forth. About a decade later, we get NAFTA. And NAFTA closed 63,000 factories across the United States, many of them in small town America, right? And here's the difference that we talk about. In small town America, often there's one factory, there's one mill, right? And when that closes in Newton, Iowa, right?
Yeah.
You know that, the Maytag. When that happens, the identity of the town is shattered, right? So we get a series of changes that are really disruptive. And then on top of that, there were, I think, some savvy politicians that understood this growing grievance and resentment in rural America and pushed the idea that Democrats don't care, that Democrats have turned their attention elsewhere. Now, there's a third piece that Nick and I have been talking about lately, and that is, well, what Democrats do about it.
Right.
And the short answer is not a whole lot.
Right.
And so you have this, right? I think what Dan's getting at is you have a set of objective criteria that are affecting communities across the country, right? Economic dislocation, China shock. The interesting thing about that is that the losers of globalization live in all sorts of communities, right? The working class in urban America gets hollowed out, as does the working class in rural America. And so to explain the difference in partisanship, you can't just look to the economic trends as real as important as they are, right? It is a political transformation. And the political transformation, therefore, involves the construction of narratives about who's winning and who's losing in American society. And the Republican Party is very successful at putting forward one narrative about who's losing and who's to blame for those losses. And although they're culpable in many of the policies that bring about or exacerbate these changes, right? Like NAFTA is signed by Bill Clinton, but it is negotiated in part and encouraged by his predecessor, George H.W. Bush. Republicans didn't, stand up and oppose the China's entry to WTO, but the Democratic Party doesn't do anything to stop it. I think the Democratic Party is, well, there are important figures in the Democratic Party that I think for a long time were on the wings. I think about Howard Dean and the 50-state strategy that said, like, hey, we need to show up everywhere. We need to show every type of community that the Democrats are good for them. And Howard Dean is notable because Howard Dean's strategy is rejected.
Right.
So
Just,
yeah,
well, just to build on that, the idea that it wasn't just the bottom up shocks, it was something else. We actually open the book about how we come in from the countryside. We each live about a half an hour out, and we come into Waterville, a very small little city, and the economic forces are the same. I mean, there's a closed down mills in downtown Waterville. I mean, but Waterville is all blue, and our communities are all red. So next point, something else was happening on top of those pieces, those shocks, China shock and NAFTA and so forth.
Yeah, and a couple things. One thing you mentioned was that connection between rural and urban poor, especially. I call that the Dollar General Coalition, because that's what we're seeing right now. They're the two places where we have the most food deserts. And it was really interesting because, like, I've been trying to tackle where I'm from. I'm in Sioux City, Iowa. My district borders South Dakota. And in my voting life, I've seen South Dakota have a senator who was the majority leader in the Senate as a Democrat to where we're at today. And in Iowa, with the caucuses moving, I view where we're at. And in 2024, we're between Wisconsin and Nebraska and South Dakota. And I think 2024 is going to show us which way are we going to bounce back and be a little bit more purple like we are Wisconsin, or are we going to be more red like the Nebraska and South Dakota? And so a lot of your book, just that's how it resonates with me quite a bit. one thing I wanted to ask you guys. When I decided to run, I did a ton of research into especially the rural vote. And I looked at former speeches of people who've done well in rural. And one of the things I was really interested in Paul Wellstone and uh, having, and I listened to one of his speeches that were on C-SPAN from like 1990, like they put it on their website or whatever, and I looked it up. And to the points he were making about worried about concentration of farms, he was worried about public education, worried about healthcare, and here we are. And I got kind of bummed down by it because here I am, a couple decades later, saying the same things. But could you guys talk a little bit about what you have seen in the rural vote? Because it used to be the on the Democratic side, this is where the more progressive side used to be, and or maybe I was wrong. I in my lifetime it has shifted, and the progressive comes from urban areas. But have you seen that shift in the last 40 years? Yeah.
Well, I just like to point out real quick, right? Like Wellstone's a great example. You're the first to ever bring him up in the conversation on the book, but he's illustrative of this point, right? To win in rural communities, you don't need to be a Republican that got their party registration mixed up, right? Like
Right.
Stone is a leader of the progressive wing of the Democrat, like an unabashed progressive, does well in these types of communities. And one thing that Dan and I stress repeatedly throughout the book is we talk about politics at World Progress Summits among academics and panels like this very differently from how many Americans talk about politics. And I don't think that's necessarily better or worse. We have the luxury of talking about policy debates and what this government action is going to do to help those groups of people and who's getting unjust benefits from that government program. We talk about policies and we try to make sense of politics by thinking that there's certain segments of society that should line up given how each of the parties are talking about certain issues. Most people, when they are making their decision about who to vote for, I think are reacting in a much more well, it's about trust. Who's on your side? Who do you have faith in to make decisions for you? Because you quite frankly don't have the time or interest to become a policy wonk. And for me, the whole story about democratic deficits in rural areas and the reasons why you don't get Wellstone figures anymore is that trust in the Democratic Party is at a rock bottom. And it's amazing. I mean, we ask Republicans, of which, again, there are millions more Republicans living outside of rural America than within rural America. We ask them about trust in government, trust in Fauci, trust in the president, trust in this, right? And it's low, as you might expect. You ask rural people, Republicans and Democrats, it's rock bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's something going on within rural communities that is just sapping people's confidence in institutions. And because it's taking place within rural communities, and this is the whole point of the book, we have to understand it as a rural phenomenon, that it's not just because they're older or whiter or maybe more culturally conservative. That can't explain the rock bottom trust because you have all those things elsewhere and they are still, although it's pretty, it's low, it's nothing to be thankful for, it's nowhere near as low as it is in rural areas.
And very much it's related. It's the same thing, but maybe in a slightly different way. It's not a function of far right policy positions, which is really what Nick's saying. We expected that. So we dove into this. They're voting so heavily for the Republican Party. They must surely be way out there on the right on a whole host of policy issues. And that's not where we find. That's just not what we find. Now, they're to the right of center, but no further to the right than mainstream Republicans in suburbans or suburbia or urban areas. So it cannot be explained by deep far right policy positions, just as Nick was saying. Something else is going on. It is this trust, it is this skepticism. And I just will add, one of the only things what we find, and I think it's in your case as well, Representative, is that there's suspicion, and every once in a while, a Democrat can help voters understand that they know the district, they know what's going on, who they are, what their concerns are. It's it's Jared Golden, and in a very red second CD of Maine. There are Marie Guzenkamp Perez in Washington. There's a couple of you. They understand that you do know the district. Is that fair to say? Would you say?
I think so. I think one of the things. I mean, I was blessed to run against somebody who was hated even amongst a lot of his own party. So that's part of it. I give that an acknowledgement. But I think one of the things that I did too was, I mean, I used to play professional baseball. Being a 6'6" white former professional baseball player goes really well in my neck of the woods, and leading with that rather than leading that I'm a Democrat. And then on top of that, I'm very much, I feel, cut from that old school Perry populism. And so talking about antitrust issues, even though that can get a little esoteric, but like right now we see with greedflation and shrinkflation and things like that, that's becoming more and more of the norm. But what I found very difficult was when I would talk about some of this stuff, it was almost siloed. You see on the Republican side and how they have such great networks, how they can get something as little as, a previous panel, we talked about the litter box and how that just exploded all across the nation on when forms of education and that conspiracy theory. But when I was talking about antitrust and how corporations are squeezing out the average farmer, I was the only one talking about it. And so there wasn't that connection to the Democrats. And so that's how in a district that had 80,000 more Republicans than Democrats, I got within 10,000 votes, I feel. But and here's, I guess, one of the things that I in my 4 years of running in that district, and then the last 2 years being in the state house, every poll I've seen, even in the most rural, the most red of red, the strong Republicans and the strong Democrats are not too far off. They're about 17%, maybe a little bit more on the Republican side, maybe up to 25%. But there is so many people in the middle, and people are frustrated with both sides. Did you guys get that in your polling, or how much of yours was partisan? And I just curious in if you've seen something similar.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Nick. You tell about the January.
I would say, I think regardless of where they live, rural or urban, most Americans feel caught in the middle. Right, we're going into now yet another election in which both of the two major party candidates that the party system has produced for us are disliked by majorities of the American population. It's an interesting phenomenon we've known for about 80 years. It might be like the only thing political scientists like truly know and have just stopped debating, that on almost every issue, right? Even highly educated individuals, boy, go into the faculty lounge at any university and college and you're bound to see this, right? Most of what we believe follows from the partisan identity that we hold. And so as Dan was saying earlier, you can ask a bunch of questions to people. Oh, well, what do you think about $50 million or $50 billion increase on Chinese tariffs on such and such and stuff? And people are like, oh, I'm not really sure. And then if you tell them, well, Trump supports this or Biden supports this, the partisans come home.
Yeah.
And so at a fundamental level, like that's why understanding the relationship of people to the parties and the symbols of the parties and the history of those parties is so important. And when you have major presidential candidates who seem to openly celebrate the fact that they got eviscerated in rural America because they're the places moving behind, but I won the places moving ahead, you can have all the white papers in the world, and people are going to hear that, and I think it's actually pretty reasonable. Say, well, goodbye.
Right. Right.
And there's another piece on top of it that scholars have figured out is the very nature of partisanship has changed, right? It used to be a difference on policy questions. Now it is a fear of the other side. We call it negative partisanship or effective partisanship. That is, we are desperately worried, fearful that the other side will take over. We don't like those people. We don't want to socialize with them. We don't want our kids to marry them. We may not even have play dates with them. That's how bad it's become. And that alone is driving vote choice. And that alone is just evaporated split ticket voting. It's like, if I'm a Democrat, I don't like Republicans. I'm not supposed to like them, all of them.
Yeah.
And that's very different. And it's unfortunate in America. It's actually something to worry about.
Yeah, I'm concerned of that, and I have a follow-up question with that. But before we do that one, there's a good question here in the chat. Being one of those rural voters, whether we're on the right or left, the one issue that comes up constantly is the amount of money and power that lobbies have over all of the government. Was the SCOTUS Citizens United decision the reason for this rural dissatisfaction?
That's a great question, because it is one of the things that we find consistently in rural voters, right? So government is just one of many enemies in this story that rural Americans are increasingly telling themselves about their relative loss or relative deprivation compared to other types of communities. Big corporations, agribusiness, influential interests in government are also a major part of that story, right? And actually, not to make this just a you brought up Wellstone, so not to make this like a retrospective on like if I remember correctly, Wellstone is one of the chief architects of campaign finance reform in the 2000s, which the Supreme Court also overturns, right? So here you have an example of a candidate doing a rural sort of prairie populist and making good on his bona fides, challenging corporate interests, challenging concentrated wealth. It's one of the things that I know Rural Democracy Initiative recently came out with a poll a couple of months showing that these things are very popular, cut across party lines. It's not a policy specific issue. It's not about a single Supreme Court case, but a general disposition to politics. Like, something is broken that we cannot overcome, and it's obvious. Part of that brokenness are the rules that concentrate interest, concentrate wealth, concentrate power.
Yeah, that's a good point. Dan, do you have anything to add, or?
Well, it's a little contrary to the premise of the question. I hate to push back a little bit on that, but scholars have been looking at this for a while, and it's not so clear that the recent campaign finance system is leading to these crazy outcomes, right? We've got Bernie Sanders raising all this money through small donations and taking Hillary Clinton right to the edge, and one outspent candidate after the other winning elections. So the relationship between all this money and election outcomes is not so clear. There's a threshold effect. I'll give you that, but it isn't the most money wins. We see that all the time in referenda races in Maine and elsewhere. The key issue, it seems to me, and that's what Nick was getting at, is perceptions of a broken system. I don't doubt for a second that the finance system is not fair, but I wouldn't put too much stock in that. What I would say is that there's this general belief that the electoral system is not working for average folks anymore.
Yeah, to bring it back to the earlier point, right, where most Americans are stuck in the middle. The question is not, oh, does Citizens United give an advantage to this party or that party? It's, does it give an advantage to the people that already have access and influence to the halls of power? keeping people that lacked that out of power and without influence. And I think most people see it.
Yeah. Here's a question that I've been wanting to ask you since I knew this panel was going to happen. So, Carroll County is a county a couple hours from me in Iowa. It was in my congressional district. In 2008, Obama won Carroll County.
Mhm.
In 2020, Trump won it at nearly 70%.
Mhm.
So there's counties like Sioux County that haven't voted above 20% for a Democratic president in my lifetime or in the last 80 years or whatever. So there's that. But then there's counties like Carroll County that has shifted like that. And I agree with you guys' assessment. I think the 1980s is a great point of where the shift at least started. And again, with NAFTA, I completely agree with that. But from 2012 on, it's accelerated. And could you talk about, like, not, I mean, obviously Carroll is one of many counties in the country, but what do you think has allowed this last decade and a half of splits?
Well, I'll start a little bit. So in 2008, Barack Obama did okay in rural areas, as you probably know. You know, I know it was Democratic caucus, but I talked to my students. If not for the Iowa caucuses, Hillary Clinton would have been president, or she would have certainly got the nomination. So it was Iowa that gave this push for Barack Obama. And in the general election, he does pretty well. So by 2012, it's all gone, right? At your point. And it gets worse and worse. So we've been scratching our heads about that. There were some policy changes that we might link to it. But we're starting to think, as Nick and I continue to think about these things, we think think the data suggests that rural areas suffered disproportionately in the Great Recession. That the Great Recession was very tough on rural areas. The employment base was less diverse, and housing issues. It became very tough and a long, slow slog for rural Americans to bounce back from the Great Recession. So I think that might be part of it. I'm sure Nick's got additional pieces.
Well, I would just, it's an open question as to whether they've even bounced back.
Yeah.
Right.
I've seen some data recently, excuse the chart, where if you look at number of jobs, number of people employed in a community in 2007, right? Both urban and rural lose those jobs in the recession. But urban regains those jobs and is now in excess of 140% of 2007 employment levels. Rural is still under. Those jobs
Right.
left didn't come back. We see similar data or similar results in some work we did this past January, where we were asking people about COVID because we see it in our communities. Like, hey, have you recovered from COVID? Because a lot of progressives, I think, have a difficult time talking about it, and they need to talk about it. They need to understand that policies affected people differently. Nobody's debating the necessariness or of those policies or the debates we had in real time. Like, there's problems as they exist in our communities now. And so Dan and I asked, like, are you doing better off or worse off than before COVID? And rural Americans said we're more likely to say, I'm still worse off than before 2020 than suburbanites and urbanites. So even among poor Americans, right, the relative situation coming out of the pandemic was not the same. To the larger point of this whole conference, like when are we talking about that? When is the New York Times going to write an article about that?
Right.
To be honest, like when's my rural senator going to stand up and talk about that? That's what we need. That's a functioning politics.
I think you're 100% accurate with the recession, the 2008. I tell folks, especially when I was running for Congress, it's like we haven't bounced back since the 2008 economic crisis. Every political journalist who came into Iowa for the caucus in 2020, I led with that because that is one of the biggest disconnects I think don't think people realize. The other thing that I think there's two other points that I tend to talk about, and this is just I don't have the data like you guys do, so take this with a grain of salt. I think the difference between social media from 2008 to 2020 has drastically changed. I think that was a huge impact, especially in rural America. In 2008, Facebook was a place where you can see that cute cat video, or maybe grandparents were getting on a little bit at that time. You just saw your classmates, but you compare that with what happened in 2016 and 2020, and there's a huge shift. And then the other, I think, shift is radio, because Sioux City, like our main talk radio station growing up was AP News. It was kind of boring. Now, I mean, in the last decade, it's all been right wing, 10 hours a day of propaganda. And I think a combination of that has had a huge impact, at least where I see.
Let me add. So you mentioned Obama. So Dan Pfeiffer wrote a book about media, and he talks about Obama in 2008. What was really helpful for Obama in 2008 was he met with local reporters over and over and over, and he had a sort of very specific, coordinated process of meeting one-on-one with local rural reporters over and over. Well, Nick and I talk about the evaporation, the disappearance of local rural media, the news deserts, the news holes that we have, right? There are fewer and fewer local journalists. And I think your comments about social media radio are spot on too.
Yeah, I mean, Sioux City alone, we're 120,000 in the metropolitan area, and our newspaper is printing only a few days a week now. So it's not just rural. I mean, yeah, and that's it, and it's frustrating because we had primaries earlier this week, and in today's mini editorial, like this front page little like couple sentence thing, it was the editorial page saying the disappointment in the voter turnout, and it's just I'm not saying it's a cause and effect. I don't have the data to back that up, but it's just it's something out there, and it's
to that point, I think it is disconcerting, and we need to think about what the disappearance of balanced news media means in different communities, and certainly I think you don't need lots of data to argue that, right, the rise of these outlets, the consolidation of news, the success of cable news, Fox, and has led to an intensification of political attitudes and behaviors among a group of residents who also live in rural America. I almost find as troubling the much larger phenomenon, which is that as these things have happened, as news deserts have increased, as local reporters have been canned, as even big metro papers have a decreasing amount of resources to put towards rural coverage, the truth of the matter is it's not so much that void has been filled by these other things as people have dropped out entirely.
Yeah.
And in that way, to me, in my mind, it makes more sense. Like that's where the social identity and the sort of unreflective, like, oh, I guess I'm just going to vote for them because everybody else is voting for them. That's why it's picked up so much steam. And I do think it would be problematic to tell a simpler, although more salacious tale of how we've all gone crazy in stark raving anger out here in the countryside because of Fox News. The truth, most people are just disaffected and distrustful, and have dropped out. That's almost just as sad.
Yeah, and again, I think the second part of the social media and radio thing is when the Democratic Party is not heavily investing in these areas, then people just kind of gravitate to what they're hearing, and that's kind of the talk of the town, and then that accelerates. And so I don't know. That's um, we need to wrap up here, but I could talk to you guys for hours. This is I'm fascinated with your work. I think you've done a great job, and just big fans of the book and everything. So with that, I want to ask two questions as we wrap things up. One is, what are you hopeful for? And two, where can people find your work and where to follow you? Dan, do you want to start?
Well, on the hopeful bit, there are real problems in rural America. We're talking about that. And I think as the Democratic Party begins to really understand these issues and zone in on these issues, we talked about populism, economic populism. I think healthcare is another one. I think there's a chance that we'll see greater two-party competition, which is what Nick and I argue about. This isn't a book about how the Democrats should recapture it's about two-party competition, which is really healthy for our democracy. So I'm optimistic that the Democratic Party's gotten the message. And I think there could be some changes. It's not going to be fast. Don't look for that in 2024 November. But I'm optimistic that the Democratic Party can stand a chance in rural America in the years ahead.
Nick?
Yeah, somewhat similarly. It's been hope restoring to see people living in urban areas wanting to talk about these issues. Again, although the vast people caught in the middle that live in all sorts of communities and talk about it in a less transactional way, less about, oh well, you're on my side or you're on their side, and more, what do we bring collectively to the table, and why should we value rural ways of living, and why should we value even urban ways of living? Again, it's a long way to go, and I would just remind folks that this is decades in the making, and it's going to have to be decades in the unmaking. And consultants are going to wake up the morning after Election Day 2024 and say, "See, you didn't stand a chance. Look at this data point, this data point." I think we're ethically obligated to continue that work, and in the long run, hopefully, we restore some semblance of functioning democracy. So. You can find our book on the giant conglomerates, or if you'd like to support the wonderful University Press of Columbia, the great big city of New York, who supported this scholarship, you can buy directly from Columbia University Press, The Rural Voter, Politics, a Place in the Disuniting of America.
Well, if you don't mind, I've got one quick question for you, JD.
Yeah.
What was your favorite pitch? I need to know what if push comes to shove, what's your pitch?
I can't throw a fastball straight to save my life. I'm 6'6", throw 3/4, and the ball comes off. And so that was my bread and butter. So I actually have a game tonight. I'm still playing. So yeah, baseball has been very good to me. I'll say that. So, like I said, I could talk for you guys for hours. Thank you for your work. I will continue to follow you guys, and eager to see what you all do next. So, with that, Dan and Nick, thank you so much for joining us at the Rural Progress Summit. Now, I'm going to turn it back over to Heidi for a discussion on the 2024 elections.